The weight of perfection crushes the soul long before it breaks the body. I know this truth as I stand motionless in the grand processional hall of Macragge, my armor polished to a mirror shine that reflects nothing of the man within. Every breath I take is measured, every thought catalogued, every moment observed. We Ultramarines do not merely serve the Emperor, we serve an ideal of flawlessness that no human was meant to bear. The Codex Astartes teaches that perfection is attainable through discipline and ritual. But as I recite the 1472nd verse from memory, I feel something stirred deep within my enhanced biology, something the apothecaries would call deficiency, but which I am beginning to recognize as the last fragment of my humanity. What happens when a space marine bred for perfection discovers that perfection itself may be the greatest flaw? My name is Decius of the Ultramarines' 4th Company, brother cohort of the Adeptus Astartes, and I can recite 1472 verses of the Codex from memory. This is not a boast. It is a symptom. When I sleep, which is rarely, the words march through my dreams in neat, disciplined rows, just as we march through the grand processionals on Macragge. The words never falter. The formations never break. Everything is perfect. Perfection has a cost that no one speaks of. I was born on Prandium, a verdant agri-world in the Ultramar system. The recruiters came when I was 11 standard Terran years. They spoke of honor and duty, of becoming something greater than human. They did not mention that to become more than human, you must first become less. The trials were brutal, but brutality was expected, pain was expected, death was expected. What I did not expect was the tedium that followed the transformation. When the final gene seed implantation was complete and I stood as a full battle brother, I believed the true glory would begin. Instead, I entered a existence, measured in inspections and evaluations. 4 hours of weapons drills at precisely 0400 hours. 2 hours of tactical simulations at 0800 hours. 1 hour of meditation on the Codex Astartes at 1000 hours. Ritual cleaning of armor at 1100 hours. And so it continued, day after day, year after year. A perfect schedule for perfect warriors. Deviation was failure. Failure was weakness. Weakness was heresy. I remember watching a squad of Imperial guardsmen once, resting between engagements during the Bellicane purification. They sat in the dirt, laughing and sharing tales of their homes. One played a string instrument fashioned from scavenged materials. Another slept soundly, snoring with complete abandon. My battle brothers observed them with contempt. I observed them with something I dared not name, even to myself. Undisciplined, Brother Toron said, his voice modulated to perfect neutrality. Human, I replied. He looked at me, his face a marble mask beneath his helm. A weakness we have transcended, Brother Decius. Had we transcended it, or merely buried it beneath layers of conditioning and ritual? The question lingered like a wound that would not heal. The first indication of my deficiency came during routine gene seed monitoring. Each Space Marine must submit to regular examinations to ensure the purity of his implanted organs. The apothecaries monitor for mutation, degradation, or corruption. Any impurity must be addressed immediately, lest it spread and weaken the chapter. Brother Decius, your catalepsian node shows minor irregularities, Apothecary Varro informed me, his eyes fixed on the data slate before him. The anomaly is within acceptable parameters, but warrants observation. The catalepsian node is the implant that allows Space Marines to function with minimal sleep. Mine was operating at 97.6% efficiency rather than the expected 98.2%. A negligible difference to any reasonable assessment, but the Ultramarines do not traffic in reasonableness when it comes to standards. Is corrective action required? I asked, maintaining the expected composure. Not at this time. Increase your meditation regimen by 30 minutes daily and report any episodes of unwanted unconsciousness immediately. I nodded and departed, adding yet another ritual to my day. 30 more minutes of perfect stillness while reciting the appropriate verses from the Codex Astartes. 30 more minutes of reinforcing the walls of my internal prison. 3 weeks later, during a night firing exercise, I experienced what the apothecaries later termed a micro-lapse in consciousness. For 1.7 seconds, I closed my eyes. Not long enough to fall, not long enough to endanger any battle brother, simply long enough for my targeting efficiency to drop by 12% on a single volley. It would not have been noticed, except that in the Ultramarines, everything is noticed, everything is recorded. Every breath judged for its efficiency, every thought scrutinized for its purity. Brother Dacius requires reconditioning. Chapter Master Calgar decreed after reviewing the reports. The protocol will be implemented immediately. Reconditioning. The word itself is a euphemism, a polite term for the systematic disassembly and reconstruction of a space marine mind. We are not permitted weakness. We are not permitted deviation. We are permitted only perfection. The process began with isolation. A cell 8 feet by 8 feet, bare except for a stone bench and a single luminator that never dimmed. The cell was located in the deepest level of the fortress of Hera, where the foundations of Macragge itself could contain any violence that might erupt from a brother whose mind was being unmade. For 3 days, I sat in perfect silence, forbidden to move from the meditation posture. Servitors delivered nutrient solutions intravenously. No speech was permitted, no questions answered. Only perfect, endless silence and the profound knowledge that I had failed to meet the standard of my chapter. On the 4th day, the chaplains came. Brother Decius, your body houses the sacred gene seed of Robute Guilliman himself. Chaplain Cassius intoned, his skull helm revealing nothing of the man beneath. Do you understand the responsibility this entails? I do, chaplain, I replied, my voice rough from disuse. Then explain your failure. How does one explain the inexplicable? A momentary lapse, a flicker of humanity in a vessel designed to transcend such limitations. I could not say what I truly believed, that perhaps the endless perfection demanded of us was itself the flaw, that in striving to eliminate all weakness, we had eliminated something essential. There is no explanation, only atonement. I answered instead, the words drawn from the Codex itself. The correct response, the perfect response. Your understanding is incomplete, Cassius said. The flaw is not in your gene seed, but in your spirit. You lack conviction, Brother Decius. You harbor doubt. He was right, of course. The chaplains are trained to detect the slightest hesitation, the smallest crack in devotion. I had hidden my questions well, buried them beneath layers of perfect compliance, but they had been there nonetheless, growing like a cancer. I will purge this doubt, I vowed. Another perfect response. No, Cassius replied, we will purge it together. What followed was a regimen designed not to strengthen the body, but to break the mind. 18 hours daily of recitation from the Codex Astartes, without water, without rest. When my voice failed, I was given stimulants to continue. When my mind began to drift, pain stimulators attached to my temples would deliver corrective shocks. Theoretical, Cassius would intone. A space marine knows no doubt, I would respond. Practical. I will exterminate doubt wherever it resides, even within my own thoughts. Hour after hour, day after day. The questions that had once seemed so important began to fade, replaced by the certainty of the Codex. This was the purpose of reconditioning, not to answer doubt, but to eliminate the capacity for doubt itself. Between recitations, I was subjected to hypno-conditioning, forced to relive battles where doubt had led to defeat. Some were historical, drawn from the chapter archives. Others were simulated, crafted by the librarians to target my specific psychological patterns. In all of them, warriors who questioned their orders died, warriors who hesitated caused the deaths of their brothers. The message was clear and relentless. During one such session, I was Brother Aeonid Thiel, marked for censure before the Battle of Calth, yet ultimately vital to the survival of the Ultramarines during the Horus Heresy. The librarian manipulating the vision clearly intended me to experience the redemption of Thiel, how his independent thinking eventually served the chapter. Instead, I focused on his red-marked helm, the badge of shame he wore for questioning tactical doctrine. Even heroes who saved the chapter were punished for deviation. The message was not what the librarian intended, but it reinforced my growing certainty nonetheless. Perfection was not just expected, it was demanded, even at the cost of reason itself. By the third week, I no longer needed the pain stimulators. My recitations were flawless, my posture never faltered, my mind no longer wandered to questions of purpose or meaning. I had achieved what the Ultramarines valued above all else, perfect, unthinking compliance, and yet, deep within, in a place the hypno-conditioning could not reach, a small voice remained. It did not speak often, and when it did, I had learned to ignore it. But it was there, preserved like an insect in amber, a remnant of the boy from Prandium who had once looked up at the stars and wondered. After 40 days of reconditioning, I was deemed fit to return to limited duties. My battle brothers welcomed me with the restrained acknowledgement typical of our chapter. No questions were asked about my absence, no mention was made of my failure. The matter was considered resolved. I resumed my place in the 4th Company, now assigned to the rearguard during combat operations, a subtle demotion that all recognized but none acknowledged. My performance was perfect, my devotion apparent, my compliance absolute. It was during this period of monitored reintegration that I first encountered the Primaris Marines. Created by Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call using improved gene seed techniques, these warriors were stronger, faster, more resilient than even traditional Astartes. They were the new standard of perfection, making obsolete everything the Ultramarines had strived for over 10 millennia. Yet they were untested in the crucible of tradition that had forged us. They knew the words of the Codex but had not lived its meaning through centuries of application. They were perfect in form but lacked the perfect devotion that came only through time and indoctrination. The tension between old and new was never spoken of openly, but it existed in every interaction, every tactical briefing, every training exercise. We, the traditional Astartes, performed every ritual with exacting precision. They, the Primaris, observed with a detachment that bordered on amusement. During one such ritual, the blessing of weapons before a campaign, I found myself standing beside Brother Vexillian, a Primaris of the Gravis Armor designation. As we meticulously applied sacred oils to each weapon component, reciting the proper litanies, he completed the task with mechanical efficiency, but none of the reverence the ritual demanded. "The weapon functions regardless of blessing," he said quietly, not looking up from his work. "The machine spirit responds to maintenance, not prayer." I should have reported him immediately. Such words bordered on tech heresy, a questioning of 10,000 years of tradition. Instead, I found myself considering his words, weighing them against my own experience. "The ritual ensures proper respect for the weapon," I replied, the approved response to such questions. "Respect ensures proper care, and reconditioning ensures proper respect," he said, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. "Does it not, Brother Decius?" He knew. Somehow, this Primaris knew of my failure, my punishment. The shame I had buried beneath perfect compliance resurged. My hands continued their work without faltering, but my mind raced with dangerous thoughts. How many others spoke of my weakness? How closely was I still being watched? "The chapter demands perfection," I said, another response drawn directly from our conditioning. "The chapter demands compliance," Vexillian corrected. "Perfection is merely the justification." Before I could respond, Chaplain Cassius approached, his skull helm turning toward us as if drawn by the scent of heresy. Vexillian immediately resumed his litanies, his voice now filled with a mockery of devotion that only I could detect. I continued my work in silence. The questions his words had stirred carefully locked away in that amber-preserved corner of my mind. That night, for the first time since my reconditioning, I dreamed. Not of perfect formations or flawless recitations, but of Prandium as it had been in my childhood. The rolling fields of grain, the 3 moons hanging like lanterns in the evening sky. In the dream, I was not brother cohort Decius, but simply the boy I had been, running through the fields with no purpose but the joy of movement itself. I woke with tears on my face, a weakness I had not displayed since my earliest days as a neophyte. Fortunately, my quarters were private, a small concession to the dignity of full battle brothers. Had anyone witnessed such a lapse, I would have been returned to reconditioning immediately. I purged the emotion with practiced efficiency, reciting the litany of focus until my mind was clear again. But the dream lingered like a scent that could not be scrubbed away, a reminder that beneath the armor and conditioning, something remained of the human I had once been. The campaign that followed took us to Parmenio, a mining world on the edge of Ultramar that had fallen silent. Initial surveys suggested Tyranid infestation, a splinter of Hive fleet Kraken that had somehow survived the chapter's previous purges. We deployed in standard Codex formation, primary elements dropping via drop pod, while flanking forces secured the perimeter landing zones. As expected, I was assigned to the rear guard, tasked with securing the landing zone and establishing the command post. It was prudent tactics, keeping a potentially unreliable brother away from the main combat zone, but the shame of it burned nonetheless. I performed my duties with mechanical precision, directing servitors in the establishment of defensive positions, coordinating with the Thunderhawk gunships that would provide air support. Brother Vexillion and his Primaris squad were also assigned to the landing zone, their Gravis armor making them ideal for holding ground against potential Tyranid burrowers. As we worked, he maintained a careful distance, never directly addressing me again after our exchange during the blessing of weapons. Yet I could feel his eyes upon me, evaluating, measuring. The first 26 hours of the campaign proceeded according to tactical doctrine. The forward elements encountered scattered Tyranid resistance, primarily Genestealers and Hormagaunts, which they eliminated with typical Ultramarine efficiency. Casualties were minimal, well within acceptable parameters. The mining colony appeared largely intact, though its human population was entirely absent, presumably consumed by the Tyranid swarm. It was during the 27th hour that the pattern broke. Forward elements reported unusual Tyranid behavior, swarm organisms retreating rather than pressing attacks, a violation of known xenotype patterns. Chapter Master Kalgar, directing the operation from orbit, ordered a cautious advance toward the primary mining complex, suspecting a trap. He was correct, but not in the way any of us anticipated. The Tyranids had not retreated. They had been driven back by something else, something that had arrived on Parmenio before us. As our forward elements approached the central processing plant, they encountered not the expected Tyranid resistance, but a force of iron warriors, Chaos Space Marines, entrenched and waiting. The Vox erupted with reports of heavy fire, of ambush. The carefully orchestrated Codex deployment, designed for Tyranid opposition, had walked directly into the guns of veteran Chaos forces. In the command post, I watched as tactical displays showed first one squad, then another, reporting massive casualties. Captain Agemman of 1st Company immediately ordered a withdrawal and reorganization, exactly as the Codex dictated in such situations. The surviving forward elements would fall back to defensible positions, while reserves moved up to reinforce. It was the perfect response to the situation, drawn from thousands of years of tactical experience. It was also exactly what the Iron Warriors expected. As the forward elements began their withdrawal, the true trap was sprung. Hidden artillery positions opened fire on the designated fallback positions, while Chaos Terminators teleported directly into the path of the retreating squads. What had been an organized withdrawal collapsed into desperate, isolated combat actions. In the command post, Captain Agemman continued to issue orders directly from the Codex Tactical Reserve, attempting to impose order on the Chaos through sheer force of doctrine. Yet with each passing minute, the situation deteriorated further. The perfect plan was failing. The perfect warriors were dying. "Captain," I said, breaking protocol by speaking without being addressed first. "The enemy has anticipated our Codex responses. We must adapt. Agemman turned slowly to face me, his expression unreadable behind his helm but his posture radiating cold fury at the interruption. The Codex Astartes has guided the chapter through 10,000 years of warfare. Brother Decius, he replied, it does not fail. Only its application can be flawed. With respect, Captain, the Iron Warriors have clearly studied our doctrine. They know what we will do before we do it. We must respond in a manner they cannot predict. The command post fell silent, every battle brother and serf present acutely aware of the breach of protocol unfolding before them. For a battle brother to question a captain was rare. For one who had undergone reconditioning to do so was unprecedented. Your concern is noted, Brother Decius, Agemman said, his voice dangerously calm. Return to your station. I complied, as was expected, as was perfect. But the small voice preserved in amber had grown louder, impossible to ignore. Brothers were dying because doctrine was predictable, because perfection had become a cage limiting our responses to those the enemy could anticipate. I watched the tactical display as squad after squad reported heavy casualties, as the carefully planned operation disintegrated into isolated pockets of resistance. The Iron Warriors were herding our forces, using our own tactical doctrines against us, driving survivors toward killing zones where their artillery could finish what their ambushes had started. Among those cut off was Brother Vexilion's Primaris squad, now defending a mining platform against waves of cultist attacks, their position surrounded and their ammunition dwindling. According to doctrine, they would hold until relieved or until they were destroyed. Relief, given the current tactical situation, was unlikely. I made my decision in that moment, though I did not recognize it as the culmination of doubts that had been building for decades. I simply knew that I could not watch more. Brothers die for the sake of perfect adherence to doctrine. Servitor, I addressed the nearest cybernetic attendant. Transmit the following message to Thunderhawk Gamma 3, Priority Alpha, Authentication Decius, 4 Company, Authorization Omega 7-7. The authorization code was valid, one of many memorized for emergency situations, though using it without direct captain authorization was a severe breach of protocol. The servitor, incapable of questioning a properly formatted command, complied immediately. Thunderhawk Gamma 3, redirect to mining platform Delta and extract Primaris squad Vexillion. Danger, close fire mission to follow on these coordinates. I transmitted the locations of the primary Iron Warriors' artillery positions, identified through careful analysis of their fire patterns. The Thunderhawk crew acknowledged without question, the pilot perhaps assuming the orders came directly from Captain Agemman. Brother Decius. Captain Agemman's voice cut through my thoughts, colder than the void of space. What have you done? I turned to face him, removing my helm for the first time since the operation began. He deserved to see my face, to know that I acted with full awareness of the consequences. I have violated protocol to save our brothers, I replied simply. I accept full responsibility. You have undermined the chain of command during combat operations, he corrected. A capital offense. Around us, the command post continued to function, serfs and battle brothers studiously focusing on their tasks, pretending not to hear the confrontation unfolding in their midst. On the tactical display, Thunderhawk Gamma 3 was already moving toward mining platform Delta, while 2 others had begun targeting runs on the coordinates I had transmitted. The operations were already failing, Captain, I said, calm despite the gravity of my situation. The Iron Warriors anticipated every Codex response. They could not anticipate disobedience. Before he could respond, reports began flowing in from the field. The Thunderhawk strikes had destroyed 2 primary artillery positions, creating a gap in the Iron Warriors' fire pattern. Gamma 3 had successfully extracted Vexillion's squad from the mining platform moments before it was overrun. Suddenly, the tactical situation had shifted. Captain Agemman stood motionless, absorbing the reports, his anger at my insubordination visibly warring with his recognition of the tactical advantage my actions had created. The perfect warrior and the perfect officer, trapped between doctrine and reality. "Continue the artillery strikes," he finally ordered, addressing the command staff rather than me. "All units, converge on Sector 7, we will exploit the gap." He turned back to me, his voice lowered so only I could hear. "You will be dealt with after the battle, Brother Decius. Return to your post." I complied, resuming my duties as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. I had broken the most fundamental tenet of Ultramarine existence, perfect obedience, and in doing so, had potentially saved the operation. The contradiction was irreconcilable within the framework of our indoctrination. The battle for Parmenio continued for 3 more days, but the momentum had shifted. With their artillery advantage neutralized, the Iron Warriors fell back to prepared positions within the mining complex. Ultramarine forces, reorganized along less predictable lines, pressed the advantage, ultimately forcing the Chaos forces to withdraw via concealed teleportation arrays. Victory, but not perfection. The mining world was secured, but at a cost of 78 battle brothers, a casualty rate well above acceptable parameters for such an operation. The after-action assessment would identify multiple failures of intelligence and tactical application, all to be studied and incorporated into doctrine to prevent similar failures in the future. For me, there would be no future campaigns. As soon as the last Iron Warrior had been confirmed, eliminated, or driven from Parmenio, I was placed under guard and returned to the strike cruiser in orbit. My weapons and armor were confiscated, my rank and honors suspended pending formal review. I was confined to a holding cell normally reserved for captured enemy combatants, a clear indication of how my actions were viewed by the chapter command. 3 days later, we returned to Macragge. I was transferred directly to the fortress of Hera, to the same isolation cell where my reconditioning had taken place months earlier. This time, however, there would be no rehabilitation. I had proven myself resistant to conditioning, a flaw that could not be tolerated within the perfect structure of the chapter. Chapter Master Calgar himself came to pronounce judgment, accompanied by Chaplain Cassius and Chief Librarian Tigurius. Their presence signified the gravity of my offense. This was not merely a disciplinary matter, but a judgment upon my very worth as an Ultramarine. "Brother Decius," Calgar began, his augmetic hands clasped before him. "You stand accused of violating direct tactical doctrine during combat operations, usurping command authority, and endangering the chain of command. How do you respond?" The question was a formality. My actions were not in dispute, only my reasoning. And reason, I had learned, held little weight against doctrine. I acted to save the lives of battle brothers when doctrine had failed to account for enemy knowledge of our tactics, I replied, standing at perfect attention despite the days of isolation. "I accept full responsibility for my actions." "Your assessment of doctrine is flawed," Cassius interjected. "The Codex Astartes contains provisions for tactical flexibility in the face of changing battlefield conditions. Your failure was not in recognizing the need for adaptation, but in taking that authority upon yourself rather than trusting your commanders. The commanders were adhering to patterns the enemy had anticipated," I countered, knowing the argument was futile but unable to remain silent. Every Codex response was being countered before it could be implemented. And yet the operation ultimately succeeded, Chief Librarian Tigurius noted, his blind eyes somehow fixing directly on me, using Codex doctrine applied by the proper authorities. "After the disruption caused by my intervention," I said, "which created the tactical opening that allowed success." Calgar raised a hand, silencing further debate. "The outcome of the battle is not at issue here, Brother Decius. Your insubordination is. You were previously subjected to reconditioning for deviation from expected standards. This subsequent, more serious violation demonstrates a fundamental incompatibility with the chapter ethos." Here it was, the judgment I had expected since the moment I gave the unauthorized order on Parmenio. I would be expelled from the chapter, my gene seed harvested, my name struck from the rolls of honor. I would become a cautionary tale, an example of the consequences of imperfection. However, Calgar continued, there is the matter of Brother Ancient Vexilion's testimony to consider. This was unexpected. I had not known that Vexilion had submitted any statement regarding my actions. Brother Ancient Vexilion credits your intervention with the survival of his squad and the subsequent tactical advantage gained, Tigurius explained, clearly noting my confusion. He has formally requested that mitigating circumstances be considered in your case. The Primaris Marine exceeded his authority in making such a request, Chaplain Cassius noted, his tone making clear his opinion of the matter. Nevertheless, his combat record grants his words some weight, Calgar replied. Additionally, there is the question of efficiency. Brother Decius has received the finest training the Imperium can provide, has served with distinction in 17 major campaigns, and represents a significant investment of chapter resources. To discard such an asset entirely would be wasteful. They were discussing me as if I were a weapon whose machine spirit had proven temperamental but potentially still useful. In a way, that was precisely what I was to them, a tool that had malfunctioned but might still serve a purpose. Therefore, Calgar pronounced, Brother Decius will not be expelled from the chapter. Instead, he will be reassigned to the Scholastica Psychana on Terra as a guardian, where his tactical experience may be of use, but his independence of thought will pose no risk to chapter operations. His gene seed will be monitored for further deterioration, but will remain viable for potential future harvesting. Exile, but not disgrace. A fate better than I had expected, but still a clear statement of my failure as an Ultramarine. I would spend the remainder of my potentially millennia-long life guarding the corridors of the psychic training facilities on Terra, far from the battles and brothers that had defined my existence for centuries. Does the condemned have any final statement before the judgment is executed? Chaplain Cassius asked, the formal words drawn directly from the Codex. I looked at each of them in turn, these paragons of what the Ultramarines represented, perfect warriors, perfect servants of the Emperor, perfect embodiments of Guilliman's vision, and in their perfection, blind to the prison they had constructed for themselves, a prison of doctrine and ritual that left no room for the humanity that the Emperor himself had sought to preserve through his grand design. The Emperor created the Primarchs, and through them the Astartes, not to be perfect automatons but to be his champions among the stars. I said, knowing these would likely be the last words I would speak on Makraj. In striving for perfect adherence to the Codex, we have lost sight of its purpose, to guide rather than to constrain. We recite its words but no longer understand its spirit. Chaplain Cassius stiffened, clearly viewing my words as further evidence of my unfitness. Tigurius remained impassive, his blind eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. But Calgar, to my surprise, nodded almost imperceptibly. Your transfer to Terra will proceed immediately, he said, ignoring my statement entirely in the official record. May you find clarity in your service there. They departed without further ceremony, leaving me to be processed by chapter serfs for my journey to Terra. My armor was taken for reassignment, my personal effects catalogued and mostly destroyed as potentially tainted by my deviant thinking. Within 24 hours of the judgment, I was aboard a naval vessel bound for the heart of the Imperium, escorted by 2 Ultramarines who had once called me brother, but now spoke to me only as duty required. The journey to Terra took 3 months, delayed by warp storms and the need to avoid a suspected Chaos fleet operating along the standard routes. During this time, I was kept in a state of monitored isolation, permitted physical exercise and basic sustenance but denied any information about chapter operations or even general Imperial news. I was already being treated as an outsider, no longer trusted with even basic information. It was during this journey that I began to recognize the patterns of conditioning within my own thoughts. Without the constant reinforcement of chapter rituals, without the daily recitations and communal devotions, small cracks appeared in the edifice of perfect obedience that had been built in my mind. I found myself questioning assumptions that had once seemed unquestionable, examining beliefs that had been presented as absolute truths. The catalepsian node irregularity that had begun my fall from grace had been deemed a physical manifestation of a spiritual failing. Yet what if the causality had been reversed? What if the years of doubt, carefully suppressed but never truly eliminated, had caused the physical symptoms rather than resulting from them? The apothecaries would dismiss such a notion as superstition, and yet the connection between mind and body has been recognized since humanity first began to study its own nature. By the time we reached Terra, I had not arrived at any grand revelation or rejected the foundations of my existence as an Ultramarine, but I had begun to see the structure of my own thoughts, to recognize the architecture of my conditioning, and in that recognition lay the beginning of something the chaplains would find even more dangerous than disobedience: true independence of thought. Terra itself was as overwhelming as the legends described, a world completely covered in the accumulated structures of 40,000 years of human habitation. Mountains had been leveled, oceans drained, continents reshaped to accommodate the teeming billions who served the heart of the Imperium. The sky, visible only rarely through the perpetual smog, was filled with the constant traffic of vessels bringing resources to the insatiable planet. The Scholastica Sicana maintained multiple facilities across Terra, but I was assigned to the primary complex near the Imperial Palace itself. This was not an honor but a practical consideration, as the presence of Space Marines was less unusual in this region, where Imperial fists and members of other chapters were often seen on ceremonial duties. My duties were exactly as described, mindless guard work that could have been performed equally well by mortal troops, but which, in the Imperial bureaucracy, had been designated as requiring Astartes protection. I patrolled the same corridors day after day, watching over psychic aspirants as they were transported from their dormitories to training facilities and back again. Most were children, their psychic abilities manifesting early and marking them for either service or execution, depending on their potential and stability. They feared me, these young psychers, as they feared everything in their new lives. Taken from their families, subject to rigorous testing and harsh discipline, they saw in my massive armored form just another aspect of the Imperial machine that had claimed them. I did not attempt to reassure them. What comfort could I offer when I myself had been claimed by that same machine millennia earlier? Years passed in this fashion, each day indistinguishable from the last. Without the constant reinforcement of Ultramarine rituals, the conditioning that had shaped my thoughts for centuries began to fade further, like paint exposed to harsh sunlight. I found myself capable of contemplation that would have been impossible on Macragge, able to examine not just my own experiences, but the very foundations of the Imperium itself. I did not become disloyal, did not suddenly embrace the ruinous powers or question the Emperor's divinity. Such dramatic shifts are the stuff of cautionary tales told to neophytes. Instead, I simply began to see the structures of power and control more clearly, to recognize how the Imperium maintained its grip on a million worlds through a combination of genuine devotion, institutional inertia, and calculated terror. In my 7th year of service at the Scholastica, an incident occurred that crystallized these developing thoughts. A young psyker, no more than 9 standard years old, manifested a surge of telekinetic ability during a training session. Unable to control the power, she accidentally injured an instructor, breaking his arm when a data slate was propelled with unexpected force. The response was immediate and severe. The girl was seized by silent custodians who appeared as if from nowhere, dragged from the training chamber, and executed in an adjoining room. I heard the discharge of the bolt pistol, saw the custodians emerge moments later, their golden armor unmarked but their purpose unmistakable. That evening, the remaining students in the girl cohort were assembled and made to recite the Litany of Control for 6 consecutive hours. 2 collapsed from exhaustion and were removed. They did not return to the dormitory that night or any night thereafter. The incident was not unusual. Similar events occurred regularly within the Scholastica, the price of maintaining the Imperium's psychic resources. What changed was my perception of it. For the first time, I saw not the necessary purging of a potentially dangerous mutant, but the terrified face of a child who had committed no crime but lacking perfect control of abilities she had never asked for. I remembered the boy on Prandium, looking up at the recruiters with awe and excitement, believing the tales of glory they shared. I wondered if he would have stepped forward had he known the full truth, not just of the physical transformation but of the mental conditioning, the slow, methodical erasure of everything that made him an individual rather than merely a weapon in the Emperor's arsenal. In my quarters that night, I committed what might be considered the final heresy for an Ultramarine. I questioned whether the pursuit of perfection itself might be flawed, whether Guilliman, in his wisdom, had intended the Codex Astartes to become a prison rather than a guide, whether the Emperor, in creating his Primarchs and through them the Astartes, had truly envisioned warriors so bound by doctrine that they had lost the capacity for the very humanity they were created to defend. These thoughts, once formed, could not be unthought. They grew in the quiet hours of my solitary duties, expanding into a comprehensive reassessment of everything I had accepted without question for centuries. I did not share these thoughts, did not commit them to any medium that might be discovered. They existed solely within my mind, a private heresy that would never manifest in word or deed, or so I believed. In my 12th year of service at the Scholastica, I was summoned to attend a visiting delegation. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Various imperial authorities periodically inspected the facilities, and an Astartes presence was often required for ceremonial purposes. I reported as ordered, expecting nothing more than a day of standing at attention while robed adepts conducted their business. What I found instead was a contingent of Ultramarines led by none other than Captain Aegiman himself. He had aged in the years since Parmenio, his face bearing new scars, his armor decorated with additional honors. Yet he recognized me immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as I approached and saluted according to protocol. "Brother Decius," he acknowledged, the use of my battle name rather than my designation as a guardian, a small but significant courtesy. "You are to accompany us to the Chamber of Vigilance. The chapter has need of your experience." I complied without question, falling into formation with warriors I had once called brothers, acutely aware of the differences between us. They moved with the perfect synchronization of Ultramarines in their prime, each step measured, each movement efficient. I matched their pace and posture from memory, but the muscle memory was imperfect after years away from the chapter. The Chamber of Vigilance was a secure facility within the Scholastica, where the most sensitive matters were discussed, protected by both physical barriers and psychic wards. Once sealed inside, Captain Aegiman dismissed the ceremonial pretense that had characterized our meeting in the public areas. "We face a situation that may benefit from your unique perspective, Brother Decius," he said without preamble. "A Primaris contingent has gone rogue in the Parmenio sector." The significance of the location was not lost on me. Parmenio, where my fall from grace had begun, and now Primaris Marines, operating in the same region, had broken from command authority. The symmetry was too precise to be coincidental. "Define rogue, Captain," I replied, careful to maintain proper deference while seeking clarification. "They have ceased responding to chapter communications, altered their patrol routes without authorization, and interfered with inquisitorial operations in the sector," he explained. "Intelligence suggests they are operating according to some agenda separate from their assigned mission parameters. And you believe I may have insight into this situation because of my own history of insubordination," I stated rather than asked. Aegiman nodded, untroubled by my directness. "The contingent is led by Brother Ancient Vexillian, the same who spoke in your defense after Parmenio." The connection seemed relevant, so that was it. They suspected that my corruption had somehow influenced Vexillian, that my questioning of doctrine had planted seeds that had grown into outright rebellion. The irony was palpable, that I, who had been judged too independent for the chapter, was now being consulted precisely because of that independence. "What specifically do you wish to know, Captain?" I asked, maintaining the formal address despite the unusual circumstances. "What motivates a Space Marine to abandon doctrine?" he replied bluntly. "You crossed that line once. Vexillian appears to have crossed it now, and with greater consequence. I need to understand his reasoning if I am to bring this situation to resolution without unnecessary losses. The question was genuine, I realized with some surprise. Agerman was not seeking merely to confirm a predetermined judgment, but actually attempting to understand a pattern of thought that was, by definition, contrary to ultramarine conditioning. It was perhaps the first time in my long service that I had seen a senior officer express something approaching curiosity about deviation from the Codex. Brother Ancient Vexillion, like all Primaris, was created according to Belisarius Caul's modified procedures. I began, organizing my thoughts carefully. His conditioning, while similar to traditional Astartes, lacks the temporal depth of ours. He has not had centuries to internalize the rituals and doctrines that define the chapter. All Primaris undergo intensive indoctrination, Agerman countered. They may lack the years, but the training is, if anything, more comprehensive than what we experienced. Training is not experience, I replied, and comprehensive is not the same as convincing. The Primaris are told what to believe, but some, like Vexillion, may question why they should believe it. I paused, considering how to express concepts that had taken me years of isolation to formulate. Captain, the Codex Astartes is presented to us as perfect, immutable, a collection of wisdom that encompasses all possible situations a space marine might face. Yet it was written by Guilliman in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, a time of unprecedented upheaval. It was never intended as scripture, but as a practical guide based on the experiences of that era. Agerman's expression remained neutral, but I could sense his discomfort with the direction of my analysis. Nevertheless, he did not interrupt, which I took as permission to continue. The Iron Warriors on Parmenio had studied our doctrines, predicted our responses. Vexillion witnessed this, just as he witnessed how my deviation from doctrine created an opening that led to victory. If similar patterns have emerged in his current operations, he may have concluded that strict adherence to the Codex is not always optimal. The Codex itself allows for tactical flexibility, Agerman insisted, the standard response to any questioning of doctrine. Within narrowly defined parameters, I countered, and always subject to command approval, which itself is bound by doctrine. If the situation on the ground changes more rapidly than the chain of command can process, or if the command itself is compromised or otherwise rendered ineffective, the Codex becomes a limitation rather than an asset. I was speaking heresy by Ultramarine standards, questioning not just specific applications of the Codex, but its fundamental role in chapter operations. Yet Agerman did not silence me, did not invoke disciplinary protocols. Instead, he appeared to be genuinely considering my words, weighing them against his own experiences. "You believe Vexillion has reached this conclusion," he said finally, "that he is operating outside of doctrine because he believes the situation requires it." "It is a possibility," I replied, though without specific details of the circumstances, I cannot speak to his precise motivations. Agerman activated a data slate, displaying a tactical map of the Parmenio sector. The region has experienced increased warp storm activity over the past 18 months. Astropathic communication is unreliable, and physical travel between systems often delayed. Vexillion's contingent was tasked with standard patrol duties, monitoring for any resurgence of the Tyranid presence we eliminated years ago. He manipulated the display, highlighting specific systems. 6 months ago, they diverted from their patrol route to investigate an unscheduled Imperial vessel in the Corinth system. After that encounter, their reporting became increasingly sporadic, then ceased entirely. Intelligence from other Imperial assets in the region indicates they have been sighted in multiple systems, apparently pursuing some objective of their own. "And the inquisitorial operations they interfered with?" I asked. "An Ordo Hereticus team investigating potential gene-stealer cult activity on Hephaestion Prime," Agerman replied. "Vexillion's forces reportedly intercepted and detained the inquisitorial vessel for 3 days before allowing it to proceed. No official explanation was provided. The pattern was becoming clearer. Isolation, degraded communication, potential Xenos infiltration, inquisitorial involvement, all occurring in a region with a complex history of conflict. Any one of these factors might lead a commander to question standard doctrine. Together, they created a situation where rigid adherence to protocol could be seen as actively detrimental. Has the chapter attempted to send an envoy? I asked. Someone Vexillian might trust to deliver orders directly. 2 were dispatched. Neither returned. Agerman said grimly, which brings us to the present circumstances. Chapter Master Calgar has authorized a full company deployment to locate and, if necessary, subdue Vexillian's contingent. Before committing to this action, he has requested all possible intelligence on the situation, including your assessment. The implications were clear. If a full company was being deployed, the chapter was prepared for combat against its own. Brother would be set against brother, a scenario not seen since the dark days of the Horus Heresy. And I, the exile, was being asked to provide insights that might prevent such a tragedy, or at least minimize its scope. With respect, Captain, my assessment based on this limited information can only be speculative, I said. However, if Vexillian believes he has discovered something that Command would suppress rather than investigate, he might feel justified in operating independently. The detention of inquisitorial forces suggests he may be attempting to prevent external interference until his objective is achieved. What objective could justify such actions? Agerman asked, though his tone suggested he was thinking aloud rather than expecting a definitive answer. That is the critical question, I agreed, and one I suspect can only be answered by direct contact with Vexillian himself. Agerman was silent for a long moment, studying the tactical display as if it might reveal secrets not contained in the raw data. Finally, he deactivated the slate and turned to face me directly. Brother Decius, you are hereby temporarily reattached to 4th Company for the duration of this operation, he declared, formally. Your status remains that of a guardian, not a battle brother, but your knowledge of both the region and the individuals involved makes your participation valuable. It was not the full restoration I might once have dreamed of, but it was more than I had expected from my life of exile. To serve alongside the chapter again, even in this limited capacity, was an honor I had believed forever beyond my reach. And yet, I found myself hesitating. Captain, I must respectfully note that my perspectives are considered aberrant by chapter standards, I said carefully. My inclusion in this operation may be viewed as controversial by the Battle Brothers. The decision has been made at the highest level, Brother Decius, Agerman replied. Chapter Master Calgar himself authorized your temporary status change. Whatever your past transgressions, your insights into deviation from doctrine are now considered an asset rather than a liability, at least for this specific situation. And there it was, the ultimate irony. The very qualities that had made me unfit for chapter service now made me uniquely valuable. The flaw had become, in the specific context of Vexillian's rebellion, a virtue. It was a pragmatic decision, entirely in keeping with the Ultramarine ethos of utilizing all available resources efficiently, and yet it represented a significant shift in how the chapter viewed independent thinking. I will serve as required, Captain, I said formally, though the words seemed inadequate to express the complex emotions the assignment stirred. Good, Agerman nodded. Report to the armory for equipment issue. We deploy in 6 hours. The deployment was conducted with typical Ultramarine precision, every aspect planned and executed according to Codex specifications. The strike cruiser Gorgon carried 4th Company to the edge of the Parmenio sector, where we transferred to smaller vessels for the final approach. Long-range augurs had detected Vexillian's forces on Corinth. 3, an agri-world with minimal Imperial presence, apparently establishing defensive positions around a remote geological research outpost. I was assigned to Captain Agerman's command squad, not as a combatant but as an advisor and potential negotiator. My armor, issued from chapter reserves, was unpainted ceramite, bearing neither the ultramarine blue nor any insignia of rank or honor. I was part of the chapter for this operation, but not truly of it, a distinction made visible in every aspect of my status. The Battle Brothers treated me with formal correctness but obvious reservations. Most were too young to remember my original service, knowing me only as a cautionary example from indoctrination texts. Those few veterans who did recognize me maintained a careful distance, as if my deviation might somehow be contagious. Only Ajaman engaged with me directly, consulting me on tactical assessments as we approached the Corinth system. Vexillion has positioned his forces to control all access to the research outpost, he observed, studying the augur returns. Standard defensive doctrine, but with unusual emphasis on ground-to-orbit coverage. He is expecting a response from the chapter. Or from someone else, I suggested. The Inquisition may have dispatched forces following the detention of their team. A concerning possibility, Ajaman acknowledged. If we find ourselves in a three-way confrontation, the tactical variables increase exponentially. Our approach was detected, as expected. Vexillion's forces made no attempt to conceal their positions or to prevent our landing craft from deploying to the surface. They established Vox contact immediately, transmitting on standard Ultramarine tactical frequencies. Fourth Company. This is Brother Ancient Vexillion. The transmission came clearly through the command Vox. Your presence is acknowledged but not required. The situation on Corinth III is under control. Brother Ancient, this is Captain Ajaman, the captain replied, his tone formal but not hostile. You have operated without authorization for 6 months, failed to respond to chapter communications, and interfered with Imperial authorities. Explain your actions immediately. There was a brief pause before Vexillion responded. The explanation requires direct interaction, Captain. Land your command vessel at the coordinates being transmitted. You and 2 others may approach the research outpost. Any attempt to deploy additional forces will be considered hostile action. The coordinates placed the landing zone well within range of Vexillion's heavy weapons. It was, from a tactical perspective, an unacceptable risk. From a diplomatic perspective, however, it might be the only way to resolve the situation without bloodshed. Who would you recommend I bring to this meeting, Brother Decius? Ajaman asked, surprising me with the direct solicitation of my opinion. I considered the question carefully. Myself, as you have already determined, given my connection to Vexillion, and perhaps a librarian, to assess the psychic conditions at the outpost and to provide an objective record of whatever we discover there. Ajaman nodded. Agreed. Librarian Severus will accompany us. Prepare for surface deployment in 30 minutes. The descent to Corinth III was conducted in silence, each of us preparing in our own way for whatever awaited us. Through the viewports of the Thunderhawk, I could see the agri-world spreading beneath us. Vast fields of grain interspersed with carefully managed forest preserves, the architecture of human agriculture imposed on the natural landscape. It reminded me painfully of Prandium as it had been in my youth, before the Tyranids had reduced it to a lifeless rock. We landed precisely at the coordinates Vexillion had provided, the Thunderhawk setting down in a cleared area near the research outpost. As the ramp lowered, I saw a reception party waiting for us, 3 Primaris Marines in Gravis, armor, their weapons holstered but readily accessible. Captain Ajaman, the central figure, greeted as we descended the ramp. Brother Decius, librarian. Brother Ancient Vexillion awaits you inside the primary research facility. The outpost itself was a typical Imperial scientific installation, prefabricated structures arranged in a functional grid, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. As we were escorted through the complex, I noted signs of recent combat, blast marks on walls, shrapnel damage to equipment, but no bodies or blood trails. Whatever conflict had occurred here had been thoroughly sanitized. Vexillion awaited us in what appeared to be the main laboratory, a large chamber dominated by complex analysis equipment and a central platform where core samples and other geological specimens were arranged in careful order. The Brother Ancient himself stood beside this platform, his massive form unmistakable even among Primaris Marines. Captain, Vexillion greeted Ajaman with a formal salute. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting, and Brother Decius, your presence is particularly appreciated. Aegiman did not return the pleasantries. Explain your actions, Brother Ancient. Why have you abandoned your assigned duties and operated without authorization? Vexillion gestured to the specimens on the central platform. Because of what we discovered here, Captain. Something that required independent verification before reporting through potentially compromised channels. Elaborate, Aegiman ordered, his tone making clear that his patience was limited. 6 months ago, we intercepted an unscheduled vessel attempting to leave this system, Vexillion began. The craft was registered to the Adeptus Mechanicus, but carried no official authorization for operations in this sector. On board, we discovered research materials removed from this facility, along with the bodies of the original research team. He moved to a control panel and activated a hololith projector. The image that formed above the platform was unmistakable to any space marine, a double helix genetic structure with distinctive markers. Gene seed, Librarian Severus identified immediately. Adeptus Astartes genetic material. Yes, Vexillion confirmed, but not from any recognized chapter. The genetic markers indicate substantial deviation from all known templates, including those of the Primaris program. The research team had been extracting these samples from geological strata dating back approximately 10,000 years. The implications were staggering. Gene seed preserved in geological samples, dating from the time of the Horus Heresy, potentially belonging to one of the traitor legions, or worse, to one of the 2 expunged legions whose very existence had been struck from Imperial records. The Mechanicus team was attempting to remove this evidence without Imperial oversight. Vexillion continued. When we prevented this, we discovered communications suggesting inquisitorial involvement in the suppression of the research. We determined that standard reporting protocols could not be trusted until we had fully documented the extent of the find and secured all samples. You exceeded your authority, Aegiman stated, though his tone had shifted subtly. This discovery should have been reported immediately to Chapter Command. With respect, Captain, the communication logs from the Mechanicus vessel indicated that multiple Imperial organizations were already aware of the discovery and actively working to contain it, Vexillion countered, including elements within the Ultramarines chapter command structure. This was the most serious allegation possible, suggesting corruption or conspiracy at the highest levels of the chapter. If true, it would explain Vexillion's decision to operate independently. If false, it represented a profound misjudgment that bordered on heresy. What evidence supports this allegation? Librarian Severus asked, his psychic hood humming softly as he presumably scanned for any signs of deception. Vexillion activated another display, showing communication logs and encrypted data recovered from the Mechanicus vessel. The research team was operating under joint authorization from elements within the Ordo Hereticus and individuals identified only by code designations. However, the encryption patterns are consistent with Ultramarine command-level protocols. I studied the displayed information carefully. The encryption did indeed resemble chapter command protocols, though with subtle variations that suggested either an older version or a deliberate modification designed to provide deniability. The content, what could be deciphered, referenced contingency protocols and historical containment procedures in relation to the geological samples. This explains your detention of the inquisitorial vessel, Aegiman noted. You suspected their involvement in the suppression effort. We confirmed it, Vexillion corrected. The Inquisitor carried authorization codes matching those in the Mechanicus communications. They were not investigating Genestealer activity as officially reported, but attempting to locate and secure the remaining samples before we could complete our analysis. And what has your analysis revealed? I asked, speaking for the first time since entering the facility. Vexillion turned to me, his expression unreadable behind his helm but his posture suggesting a certain relief at the question. Confirmation that the gene seed samples belong to Astartes who fought on both sides of the Horus Heresy, including legions whose existence has been purged from official records. The lost legions, Librarian Severus breathed, the words barely audible. Yes, Vexillian confirmed. And evidence that elements of those legions may have been incorporated into the Ultramarines and other loyalist chapters following their official expungement. The genetic markers suggest deliberate manipulation to obscure the original legion templates, but traces remain that can be identified with proper analysis. The revelation was beyond heretical. It challenged the very foundations of the Adeptus Astartes, suggesting that the pure bloodlines each chapter claimed might be compromised by genetic material from the lost and purged. If true, it would explain why multiple Imperial organizations, potentially including elements within the Ultramarines themselves, would work to suppress the discovery. Captain Agemman was silent for a long moment, processing the information and its implications. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Brother Ancient Vexillian, I understand now the reasoning behind your actions. However, this information cannot remain solely in your possession. It must be properly evaluated by appropriate authorities. And who would those authorities be, Captain? Vexillian asked. The same who ordered this research suppressed. The same who dispatched the Inquisition to secure the evidence before it could be properly documented. Chapter Master Calgar. Agemman replied without hesitation. Directly and personally, with no intermediaries, I will escort you and your evidence to Macragge under my personal protection. It was a significant concession, acknowledging the legitimacy of Vexillian's concerns while still maintaining the chain of command. The Brother Ancient considered the offer for several seconds before responding. Acceptable, under one condition, he said finally. Brother Decius accompanies us as an independent observer. His experience with both chapter politics and the consequences of challenging doctrine makes him uniquely qualified to ensure this matter receives proper attention rather than bureaucratic burial. Agemman turned to me, his expression unreadable. Would you accept this role, Brother Decius? The question represented a crossroads in my existence as an Ultramarine. To accept would be to re-enter chapter politics at the highest level, potentially exposing myself to the same forces that had engineered my exile years before. To refuse would be to abandon any hope of resolving the situation peacefully, potentially condemning battle brothers to fight each other over secrets buried millennia ago. I will serve as required, I replied, the same words I had used when accepting the mission initially, but now carrying a weight I had not anticipated. Then we are agreed, Agemman declared. Prepare your evidence and select a small contingent to accompany us. The remainder of your forces will return to regular duties under 4th Company command. We depart for Macragge immediately. As the arrangements were made and the evidence secured, I found myself standing beside Vexillian at the viewport of the research facility, looking out over the rolling fields of Corinth III. The scene was peaceful, belying the potentially explosive nature of the discovery made beneath its surface. You knew this would happen, I said quietly, not looking at him. From the moment you diverted to intercept that Mechanicus vessel, you knew it would lead to a confrontation with the chapter. I suspected, Vexillian admitted, but I did not anticipate your involvement. That was an unexpected variable that worked in our favor. Because of what happened on Parmenio, I surmised. You saw then that doctrine could be questioned, that deviation could sometimes lead to better outcomes. I saw that an Ultramarine could think independently and still remain loyal to the Emperor's true purpose, he corrected. A rare quality, and one I hoped might still exist within you despite your years of exile. I turned to face him fully, and if this matter is suppressed despite our efforts, if chapter politics proves stronger than the truth, then we will have done our duty nonetheless, he replied simply. And history will judge us as it will, but I suspect that Guilliman himself, now returned to lead the Imperium, might take a personal interest in evidence concerning the lost legions, particularly if that evidence suggests his own Ultramarines might carry their genetic legacy. The mention of Guilliman's return, still a source of awe and uncertainty within the chapter, reminded me of how much the galaxy had changed during my exile. Perhaps it was fitting that as the Primarch himself had returned to challenge 10,000 years of imperial dogma, his sons too were beginning to question the rigid structures that had defined their existence. As we prepared for transport to the waiting strike cruiser, I found myself reflecting on the strange symmetry of my journey. I had begun as a perfect Ultramarine, become a flawed exile, and now returned as neither, but perhaps something more valuable, a bridge between rigidity and revolution, tradition and truth. The weight of perfection that had once crushed me now seemed a burden I had needed to set down in order to truly serve. Not just the chapter, not just the Imperium, but humanity itself, whose contradictions and complexities could never be contained within the pages of any codex, no matter how perfect its author had been. Perhaps that was Guilliman's true wisdom, not the rules he had written, but the understanding that rules themselves were only tools, meant to guide rather than confine. And perhaps, in our different ways, Vexillian and I had rediscovered that wisdom, not through perfect obedience, but through the very questions that the pursuit of perfection had taught us never to ask. As the Thunderhawk lifted from the surface of Corinth III, carrying us toward an uncertain reception on Macragge, I found a strange peace in that realization. Whatever awaited us, whatever judgment the chapter might render, we had done what Space Marines were created to do, not merely follow orders, but protect humanity's future, with all its glorious, terrifying potential for change. In the grim darkness of the far future, perhaps the greatest heresy was not imperfection, but the belief that perfection itself could ever be truly attained. And the greatest loyalty was not blind obedience, but the courage to question when questioning was needed most.